Good evening, all, and welcome back to Ethics. So tonight we are going to talk about some basic ethical ideas, and then we're going to move into our first reading, which was Socrates' Euthyphro. So hopefully you have read that by the time you are watching this. If not, you may want to pause it and then go read Euthyphro and then come back to it. But let's jump right into it here. So some of the easiest definitions that we're going to get here are ethics for our purposes is going to be a rational inquiry into how to act and how to lead one's life. And so to break that down a little bit, when I emphasize rational here, well, first of all, it's an inquiry. So we know that we're inquiring, and that's going to require that we ask questions. It is a rational inquiry, meaning it's not an emotional inquiry, neither is it a passionate inquiry, but a rational one, okay? To that end, we're concerned with the voluntary conduct of people who have reasoned control over their actions and attitudes. Now, classically, that's considered to exclude four main groups of people: the very young, the very old, the mentally handicapped, and the completely insane. We run into very difficult times in some of these, though, because how young is too young to have moral faculties, to know right and wrong? Is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 6? It's going to vary depending on who the kid is. How old is too old to still have reasoned control over your actions and attitudes? I know a 99-year-old who's sharp as a tack. I know 60-year-olds who are starting to slip a little bit. And so that's kind of one of those gray areas as well. As we get into the medical issues, pediatrics and gerontology notwithstanding, we've got the how profound must the mental handicapped be to say that you don't actually have control over these things, or how schizophrenic, bipolar, or whatever other sort of mental illness, how bad must that be to not have reasoned control? Now, for our purposes, the terms ethics and moral philosophy are going to be completely interchangeable, and that's a quiz question. Ethics is a normative enterprise. What that means is exactly what it sounds like. We are trying to establish norms of behavior. So how people normally behave. Now, it's not a descriptive enterprise. Descriptive enterprises would be the social sciences, or the so-called soft sciences, things like sociology, psychology, anthropology, and the rest of it. An anthropologist may well study a primitive tribe and engage in descriptions of their behavior, okay, without interjecting any kind of normative judgment on it. So they may say that a given tribe practiced cannibalism as a way of revering their ancestors, which some in fact do. So grandpa dies, and the best way to honor his memory is to eat part of him, and so take his spirit into yourself. Now, that would be a descriptive thing. A normative thing might be to append onto that statement, and it's wrong, or it's gross, or whatever the case may be. Now, there are other normative enterprises, things like law, religion, etiquette. Things like that are also normative, but they differ quite a bit. So and we'll come back to those. What moral philosophy does is basically three large things, okay? First and foremost, it's going to attempt, which implies that it's not necessarily going to be successful. It's going to attempt to develop a principled account of how you ought to act, how you ought to live, what values you ought to accept, what kind of goals are worth having in life, and how you pursue that best possible life. It's then going to examine what goes into choosing and living well. And by that, we mean, what is that best possible life? What does that look like? If you can kind of see through that curtain there, that's my library in there. My best possible life involves me, my library, possibly some cats, good scotch, and cellar full of pipe tobacco. So that may not be your thing, but the best possible life is going to be one of those questions of, is this one size fits all? Is this many possibilities within a larger whole? And how do we go about pursuing that? Is it just about pleasurable things like I've just listed off? And then finally, we're going to proceed with an assumption, being very careful with those assumptions, that there are actually right and wrong answers to the questions that are raised. Some of these answers can be rationally supported, others can't. And that's where we stick into that reason versus emotion or passion kind of thing, okay? Now, if we think about the law, ethics and the law both function socially to kind of control and coordinate our behavior and our conduct, and it makes it possible for individuals that have diverse goals to live with one another. If I have the goal of securing money by teaching you philosophy, and someone else has the goal of securing money by robbing the bank that's across the street from me, we're going to run into some problems. We've probably met an impasse, and the law has a special place where they can go and live with other people who will break laws. But law is often much more formalized than morality. If you watch lawyer commercials, besides seeing car accidents and American Eagles and flags waving and stuff, usually they've got a whole big bookcase behind them, which is the Texas Legal Code, which I think runs to several hundred, if not over 1,000 volumes at this point. So very, very formalized. And you've got to have those specific laws with specific punishments there. There's also penalties for those violations. In the law, you could be fined, you could be imprisoned, you could be executed. In ethics, we really don't have that. We might have a pang of conscience. We might earn the disapproval of others for our actions, but that's really about as steep as it goes. There is some limited overlap. Some illegal actions are also immoral. So stealing from someone or killing them without cause, that's illegal, also immoral. Many legal rights do have a basis in morality, though. So we find things that are moral types of things that become introduced into the codes of law. Now the question is do we have a moral obligation to obey the law? That's kind of a troubling one. Certain laws, it seems like, well, yes, I have a moral obligation not to kill people if I don't have cause, and to vote in elections and things like that. But I don't feel as immoral if I'm going, say, 5 miles over the speed limit, as I almost always do. So where do we find that break in that? That's kind of difficult. We've got to remember that the aim of law is not to enforce morality. The law should not try and make you a moral person. This is one of those things also where you can't effectively legislate morality. If you outlaw alcohol, people are making it home in the bathtub. If you outlaw medical procedures, people are going to find ways to get them. Now, that's not to say that some things shouldn't be tried, but there has never been an effective attempt to legislate morality that has had lasting consequence and not without fairly dangerous repercussions. Now, not all illegal acts are immoral. Things like, I don't know, Wesley Snipes went to jail for not paying his taxes for an extra special long time. And that's really illegal. That's federally illegal. Now, you could make a convoluted argument that the tax revenue goes to support programs for widows and orphans and so on and so forth, but really, it's not on the face of things immoral unto itself. Not all immoral acts are illegal. For instance, I'm wearing my wedding ring. Adultery would be immoral, but it is perfectly legal, unless, of course, you find yourself under the confines of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, in which case it is also illegal, especially for officers. Can laws themselves be unjust or immoral? Well, certainly. We can probably think of a handful of laws, either extant laws or past laws. Jim Crow comes to mind, apartheid comes to mind. These things were perfectly legal, but they were completely immoral. And so some of that we have to reconcile across history also. Now, most religions include or support a moral code. So for more on that, you have to sign up for World Religions, but you might be surprised to learn that almost every world religion, to include Satanism, believe it or not, involves a version of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, there's a more narrow sense in religion, though. It's how we regard God or the gods and how God or the gods regards us. Religious duties, though, are not always moral duties. So, for instance, if we think about, say, the 5 pillars of Islam, so major world religion, you've got fasting during Ramadan. All of these are religious duties. That's not really a moral duty. Pilgrimage to Mecca, not really a moral duty. Pledging the faith, not really a moral duty. Ritual prayer, not really a moral duty. Charity to the poor, possibly a moral duty. So there you've got 1/5, or roughly 20% of the major obligations of a major world religion that might have some limited overlap, but really a lot of that is outside the bounds of morality. Now, while morality is often given within a religious context, it doesn't necessarily have to be. So folks from the Judeo-Christian tradition are probably familiar with the 10 suggestions, commandments. And the 5th through the 9th commandments, those are the ones on the second side of the tablet there, are usually considered the so-called social commandments. These are the ones that deal with how we treat other people, okay? But does religion have to be the vehicle for morality? No, absolutely not. Now, regardless of how you feel about religion, you could be a perfectly moral atheist. You could also be, and you probably ought not to be, an immoral Christian, Buddhist, Sikh, and so on. The difference is, on the one hand, you've got divine revelation. God telling you, do these things, don't do these things. On the other hand, you've got human reason. Man thinking for himself, and ladies, remember you're included in man in this context, man in the sense of anthropos, men, women, humans, people, us, that religions can support both of these within them. God can tell you things, and you can decide things. With a variety of religions, though, there becomes contention. So what if you have a different concept of God? Or what if you have multiple gods? Or what if your gods are more permissive on this aspect than on that one? And now there's going to be problems. And so trying to tie this to a religious basis can sometimes be problematic. Now, if we talk about etiquette, which actually does have the same root word as ethics, these deal with how we ought to behave in certain circumstances. Remember, ought functions very much like that other English word should. The difference is, one is suggestive, the other is imperative. You should change your oil about every 4,000 to 6,000 miles of driving. You really ought to get those brakes checked before you go out on the road again. As you can see, the one gives you some advice. It suggests that possibly you follow this course of action. The other one is imperative. You better do this, and if you don't do it, it may come at your peril to some extent. So very different senses of ought there. And again, social custom does not equate to moral principle. Like with law, behavior that's completely morally innocent may be completely contrary to the rules of etiquette. If you, I don't know, pick your teeth or cut your toenails at the dinner table, flagrant violations of etiquette, perfectly ethical, still gross, so don't do it. Now, what's the relevance of this? Well, ethics can't be avoided like other academic pursuits. I know absolutely nothing about German literature of the Renaissance. I just don't, not a whole lot. Italian, got it. French, kinda. Spanish, comfy. German, don't know. Simply don't know. Now, I've been able to successfully avoid that for going on 40 years. That's an impressive track record, which tells me that it can be avoided by people. Ethics, you simply can't. These things are going to come up, they're going to be prescient in issues for you, and they're going to be encountered by all reflective people. That is, anybody who stops and thinks about their behavior from time to time, however large the lag in between there, is going to face ethics. Almost all of us have accepted moral precepts that we learned while growing up. Now, how do we do that? Later on in the semester, Soren Kierkegaard is going to very importantly ask, when do our ethics become our own? That is, when am I doing something because I know it's the right thing to do, and not simply because mom, dad, priest, rabbi, imam, shaman, witch doctor, whomever told me this was the right thing to do? Okay, so we're focusing mostly on moral and ethical theory as opposed to applied ethics, but there are going to be some instances in which we want to apply it as well. Now, the big question of this is, what is good or bad or right or wrong? And if we get an answer to this, it won't necessarily, but it can provide guidance about the kinds of goods that are worth seeking in life and basic principles that govern our actions. One of the things that we have to think about, though, is from whose perspective? For instance, is it always consistently good when we flourish and bad when we suffer? Now, I don't know. My kids suffered the other day because they got their flu shots. I've got to suffer in a few weeks because I have a dentist appointment. Both of these things are really in our best interest. And so it doesn't seem to be as simple to equate bad with suffering and good with flourishing. Ethics is going to try and articulate. That's a lot of what we're doing this semester together, is I'm trying to help you articulate why you do the right thing in the way that you do it, and so that your action becomes defensible. How we distinguish right from wrong is one of those things that's really difficult to articulate. If I were to ask you, for instance, your definition of the word bad, the first thing that comes to mind is probably, well, it's not good. If by extension our definition of good is all those things which are not bad, we really kind of find ourselves stuck. We can't go too much further with that. Further, this is going to be how we determine our moral duties and obligations. That is to say, what are those things that we have to do? Even if we don't potentially want to do them, we just have to do them because we're duty bound or we're obliged to. Now, what we mean by good, this is really tricky, because what is desirable for its own sake, what we're going to call intrinsically good, self-contained good, is what philosophy means when it says good, that which we want just because we want it, okay? And really, we're kind of back to that notion of telos, end, aim, plan, goal, design, or outcome. Are things good because they work towards a goal, or are they good just on their own? Philosophy is always going to be concerned with those final ends. We want the things that are good in and of themselves. Now, some of the questions that we might look at with this are there universally valid moral precepts that all people in all societies, in all places, ought to accept, just on the face of things? And that becomes really difficult. We can probably come up with a few things that people should never do, regardless of circumstance, but it becomes kind of hard to say in any broad, really meaningful ways what everybody should be doing all the time, everywhere. It's just difficult. To list them is potentially to limit them. Are there uniquely right answers to this kind of question? Well, maybe, but again, it kind of depends on your school of thought. And how do we justify these ethical precepts that we accept? So if I say, yes, I ought to be good and obey my rulers and pay my taxes and participate civilly in government and so on and so forth, how do I justify that? In other words, how do I teach someone else to do it and really get them to buy into it? That's really kind of the crux of the argument. Now, the really, really big question in all this, you ready for the big question? Here's the big question. Given the possibility of conflict between ethical demands and self-interest, why should we act justly or morally, especially in situations where we are required to refrain from some action that would contribute to our happiness or where we can profit from injustice? That's a big question. In other words, we're spending an entire semester together, you and I, to talk about ethics, to learn about doing things ethically. Someone, somewhere, unless you're just along for the ride or my wonderful presence or mellifluous voice, someone somewhere thought that you needed to learn this stuff. Now, why do we focus so much on ethics when ethics is kind of difficult? Ethics is, at the very least, kind of a pain in the butt. It's much easier to break the rules and misbehave, and usually we're much more consistent about being able to do that. So why all the focus on being good when it's so much more fun to just be bad? How's that question been answered? Mostly by old dead white guys. Plato is going to tell us next week that only the just are truly happy. And the problem then becomes, well, does happy equate to ethical? And also, how do we know who the just are? So really, we're just kind of shifting the burden onto another construct. Aristotle will tell us the week after that we must act virtuously. Okay, so think of some potential problems of that while I enjoy my sparkling water. Which virtues must you practice, and to what extent? Aristotle is going to give us a whole laundry list of virtues: justice, temperance, prudence, fortitude, courage, kindness, and the list goes on. Do you have to be all of those things? What if you're one of them really good, but the rest you kind of suck at? How, again, are we going to do this? Hobbes, whom I really like, I think you're going to like too, will tell us that over the long term, our self-interest prevails. In other words, humans as a species are so selfish that we can actually predicate our ethics on our selfishness. You'll see. Hume is going to say we're naturally sympathetic. Literally, we share the same pathos, the striving, the yearning, or desperation with those around us, and we want to do what's in their best interest. Immanuel Kant is going to tell us that we have to appeal to our reason, that again, we can't be emotional or passionate. We must always think of these things solely in terms of reason. Now, all of these are going to fit into four broad categories, the big four theories. Virtue ethics is exactly what it sounds like. Seeking virtue and avoiding vice. How do I know which virtues to practice? How do I avoid certain vices? Pardon me. The deontological, which sounds complex but isn't, comes from the Greek word deon, which means duty or obligation. How do I act according to duty or obligation? Or which obligations or duties do I find myself saddled with? The consequentialist theory is exactly what it sounds like. What are the outcomes, the goals, dare I say the consequences involved with a given course of action? And then finally, the existentialist. The existentialist is keyed in on existence. What is my individual responsibility for behavior in a certain way? Now, all of these are going to do the exact same thing. They're all going to help the little old lady up off the sidewalk instead of stepping gingerly over her and continuing on your merry way. But the reasons why they help her are going to be very, very different. The virtue ethicist may think it's a virtue to help people in need. The deontologist may say, I'm duty-bound or obliged to help people in need. The consequentialist maybe sees the best outcome if all people are helped. And the existentialist says, it's my responsibility. And if I don't do it, maybe nobody else will. So it's got to get done. Now, what normative ethics really is trying to do is come up with a substantive account of all this stuff, how we ought to act and how we ought to live. And by substantive, we mean it's got some substance to it. There's some meat on the bones. It's not just, well, I did it because it's the right thing. It gives me some substance by which I can explain why I'm going to go about this in this certain way. Now, beyond substantive issues, the subject matter of meta-ethics, which is another thing, is normative ethics itself, talking about how we talk about ethics. And so it's going to discuss the meaning of ethical terms, the distinctions between things like facts and values, and how we justify moral claims without necessarily giving us a very specific account of good and bad and right and wrong. So meta-ethical questions would be things like, can the right and good even be defined? If they can they be defined in descriptive or factual language? That is, can we say the right is like this, the good is like this, and compare them as kind of an analog? Are there natural properties that have kind of empirically discernible features that go along with scientific descriptions of these things? Are they even reducible to empirical features? In often cases, they aren't. So these are things that we need to consider. And now we're going to kind of switch gears, and we're going to talk about the first era in ethical history. So during the course of the semester, we're going to discuss three distinct eras. First tonight is the classical and medieval. Later on, we will be getting to the early modern in several weeks. And then finally, we will do the contemporary. So what I'll do as we encounter each of these is I'll talk a little bit about the era itself and some of the defining characteristics and things that we find in that. And then I'll talk about the first of our philosophers from that era. So as we look at the classical and medieval, kind of the 25,000 foot view here is we've got about 1,600 years that we're covering between now and just a few weeks from now. So between Socrates and Thomas Aquinas. And during that time, we're going to see a shift of Western civilization. First from the Aegean, so the sea that surrounds Greece, and the Mediterranean, kind of that larger area. First to Rome, which is within the Mediterranean, and then second up to Western Europe, places like France, Germany, England, and so on. Now, as we do this, the character of religious belief is also going to shift from pagan polytheism through Orthodox Christianity, and finally to Roman Catholicism. Now, why specifically Roman? Well, because by the time that we're doing this, the Reformation hasn't happened. And in the middle of this, there's been a schism between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. And that shift is going to have profound influences on the moral philosophy and the study of ethics during that time. So between the ancients and the medievals, we're going to have a huge change. And that's why it's important to really emphasize 1,600 years is taking place, even though we're covering it in a few weeks, in the way that thinkers understand the relationship that obtains between religion and ethics. So in Euthyphro, which you were to have read for this evening, here we've got the independence of ethics being defended from theology. In other words, we make no appeals to the gods. Medieval thought is going to use reason, but ultimately it's going to appeal to religious faith, and ethics and meaning are only going to find themselves within a theological framework as context. That's going to determine all sense of human value as well as what those values ought to be. So part of this is the conception of human nature and value between pagans and Christians. So a pagan, just so we're all on the same page, the word actually comes from the Latin pagan, which meant someone who lives out in the country. Okay, so someone who is far from the the scope of things, is not going to get the latest and greatest updates, and is maybe a little slower to catch on. So someone who still worships the old gods, for instance, today it's taken on a almost purely religious meaning as someone who worships gods like the Greek, Roman, or Norse or Egyptian pantheon. Okay? So the first of these differences, the conception of human nature, has to do with the place of humankind in relation to the external natural world. That is, what is the nature of human nature and where do we fit in things? So we've got birds, bees, rocks, trees, us, everything else. Okay? The contrast here is between classical naturalism, which is exactly what it sounds like, nature, and Christian supernaturalism. The Latin prefix super means above, kind of like sub means below. So a submarine below the sea. Supernatural is above the natural, more than natural, adjacent to the natural. Its Greek root analog would be metaphysical, beyond the physical. Okay? The second of these is, what is the highest good that we can get as human beings? And here we've got a contrast between humanism, which is, again, kind of what it sounds like, and Christian otherworldliness. So if we jump into this, the classical view of man is probably best summarized by a quote from the poet Sophocles. He said, "Wonders are many, and none is more wonderful than man." So that sounds cool, looks good on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt. What does it mean? It basically means this: we are just a part of nature. We're the product of natural forces. You see, when two people care about each other very much, you've already had that talk at this point. But basically, we were made in a natural way, and everything in our world, birds, bees, rocks, trees, and us, has to be understood in purely natural terms, because that's all there is. The Christian view of man changes substantially. Everything that exists, including man, is the product of God's created workmanship, but we are absolutely unique from everything in that God created us in his own image, and because we have this supernatural, this more than natural component, a soul. Who knew? Now, the soul, and we don't mean this in the way the Greeks do when they say mind, besides distinguishing us from every other created being, my German Shepherd outside, my cat over there, and so on, makes us truly the children of God in the Christian conception. Now, if we talk about the other split, what is the nature of our highest good? The classical view is humanism. If we are natural creatures, alike in kind to the rest of animate nature, then our good, and any capacity we might have to do good, must be in this world, in the present life, because this is all we got. Now, the good to be sought, whatever it might be, is going to be gained in a natural way. And if you look at the ancient Romans, they really kind of exemplified this pretty well. They had something that they called the Roman orgy. He's not going to talk about that, is he? Oh, yes, he is. Now, dirty minds notwithstanding, what the actual orgy started out as was a feast. So you would eat a bunch, you would drink a bunch, you would go next door to the vomitorium, make room for more, come back, eat a bunch, drink a bunch, maybe bump into a few people, which gave rise to our now modern understanding of this. And why would they treat themselves like this? Well, because this was all there was. If you're only getting one shot at this, you might as well have a good time. With the Christian conception, though, now we get the rise of otherworldliness, the other world in question being heaven. Okay? It's really not the goods of this world that are important now, but the supreme good that's going to be found in the presence of God, beyond the grave. So this life really doesn't have any intrinsic value of itself. Remember how philosophy views the good. And life's higher purpose is really just prepare us for the hereafter. This is more or less just a boot camp for heaven. Because only in that immortal state can the human enjoy its highest good, in God's presence. Now, here's where they overlap. This is what they share. And they wouldn't have known they shared this, obviously. This is retrospect. The classical and medieval moral philosophers all have a teleological view of God. Or, I'm sorry, view towards ethics. So they are plan-based, goal-based, outcome-oriented sorts of folks in their moral thinking. The pagan wants to achieve whatever is the highest human good and feel the best. The Christian wants to achieve the presence of God. Okay? Their primary concern then is with that ultimate end, whatever they happen to view it as, respectively. So the good is going to be the standard by which the actions and states of characters are assessed. Actions are good and attitudes are good if they contribute to us realizing the final end for wherever we happen to find ourselves. Now, brief roadmap of where we're going in the coming weeks. In Plato's Republic, we're going to see the major emphasis being on the form of the good as the heart of reality. And a note on that, it's going to be a little tricky in the reading. In philosophy, when we say something is formal, we don't mean it's wearing a tuxedo. We mean it exists as a concept only. It's a form, an idea, a concept, a thought, if you will. Okay? Then we'll get to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is kind of fun to pronounce. He's going to want to know, what is the nature of the true human good? That is, what is eudaimonia? Eudaimonia is usually translated as happiness. We're going to say it can be variously translated as happiness, perfection, fulfillment, satisfaction, flourishing. And then finally, we're going to jump another 800 years or so to Augustine and Aquinas. And now the only goal worth seeking is going to come in the afterlife, where the soul enjoys eternal felicity, not the show, but the concept, means like happiness, in communion with God. And we should all act virtuously now, because that's God's command for us to find happiness. So we jump into Socrates' Euthyphro. Now, if you like reading plays, I love reading plays. My wife hates reading plays. But I can sit there and imagine it all in my head, and Socrates speaks, and Euthyphro speaks, and Socrates speaks, and Euthyphro speaks. In Socrates' Euthyphro, our summative quotation is, piety and what is pleasing to the gods are different things. Well, that's going to tell us something. Now, the key concept here is piety or pious. Something is pious if it shows proper respect for the gods, or more generally, if it's righteous or right. So if you wanted to and had a lot of time on your hands, you could go back and read Euthyphro again, and every time one of them makes a reference to piety, you could supply good or moral or ethical or right, and it would still carry on the exact same meaning. In fact, it would be a little closer for our purposes. So piety is kind of that feature that's general, common to all those actions, that shows respect for the gods. Now, a little bit about Socrates. His years, circa 469 BC, we honestly don't know. That's why it's circa, close to, near, to 399 BC. And so BC, obviously before Christ, as opposed to AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. If you had a history teacher that told you that stood for after death, find them, slap them. They're wrong. If you're uncomfortable with the religious connotation, you can, of course, say BCE and CE, before the Common Era and Common Era. They're tagged to the exact same event, but whatever makes you happy. Now, here's the frustrating thing about Socrates. He never wrote anything down, at least nothing that we actually have. Everything that we know about him comes from Plato, primarily, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. Plato is going to feature Socrates as kind of the chief speaker and the main character, the hero of our story, if you will, of almost all of his dialogues. Not quite all of them, but almost. And he's usually going to name those dialogues after whomever Socrates happens to be arguing with. So in this case, it's Euthyphro, and another one's Meno, Crito, and so on. Xenophon was his next door neighbor. He was his buddy. He was his, he had him as a walk-on character in several of his plays and shows him as a nice guy, a pious guy, a good teacher, and so on. Aristophanes kind of pokes fun at him. Aristophanes likes to use Socrates as sort of the prototypical philosopher that's so into his own head that he doesn't pay attention to practical type things. Somewhere in the midst of all of this was probably what Socrates was actually like. Now, we get from him Socratic irony. So the irony in Euthyphro, for instance, is that he keeps asking questions to which he ostensibly knows the answers to, and also the Socratic method. That's what you were taught in school. Ask a question, look at evidence, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, Euthyphro comes from the Greek word euthyphron. It means right-minded or sincere. And as we're reading Euthyphro, we probably are left with the idea, at least initially, that Euthyphro seems to have the best of intentions. So he's at the court of law to try his father for murder. Okay? Seems to be there, seems to have the best idea in mind, and yet he's just not getting it on some level. So he's attempting to answer Socrates' question, what is the pious, tosion, and what is the impious? That's how you pronounce that, by the way, toanosion. And it takes place in the weeks leading up to Socrates' own trial, and the dialogue features Socrates and Euthyphro, because Euthyphro was kind of famous, or infamous perhaps, for claiming to be a religious expert. And so they're going to approach this to try and pinpoint a definition for piety through the use of a dialectic, which will involve dialogue, reasoning, and argumentation. So ironically, Socrates is ultimately going to be tried for impiety. Now, Socrates' method was he would walk around the agora. So think about pictures or postcards or whatever that you've seen from Greece. Probably at least one of them featured the Parthenon, that kind of, prototypical columns with a peaked roof and so on. The agora is down at the base of that, and it was a big open marketplace. So if you've ever been to a flea market, you pretty much got the idea. Our word agoraphobic, if you know someone who's agoraphobic, they're afraid of wide open spaces, like the Dixie Chicks. Now, the agora was this big marketplace, and people would come and set up their stalls, and there'd be actors and jugglers and all sorts of different things. And Socrates would walk around and ask people these questions and engage in these dialogues. Now, we know that he was married, and I always kind of like to picture his wife off to the side going, Socrates, don't, oh God, he's doing it again. Where he would just go up and be like, hey you're supposed to know a lot about this. Come here, I got a few questions for you. So in Euthyphro, when he's asking what makes an action pious, he's really asking what makes an action right or ethical. So is an action pious because it's pleasing to the gods, or does it please the gods because it's pious? That is, it's inherently good. So the dialogue is going to raise some questions about the connection between morality, religion. Is morality based on the will of God? And if so, how? And so if we look at these assumptions, they kind of force morality to either be dependent on or independent of religion. Now, let's assume the former, if it's dependent on. If an action is right because it accords with the will of God, now morality is dependent on a foundation in religion. And the only way you can know what's right then is if you have knowledge of God's will through a scripture, whether it be the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the Quran, whatever you like, an edict, someone saying, this shall be done, or revelation. God talks to you and says, do these things, don't do these things. If God's will makes actions right, we have to then ask, could God make anything right? Could he say, just kidding, folks, only 9 commandments, feel free to murder when you need to? Well, that doesn't seem really likely. Assuming the latter, if morality is independent of religion, if God wants us to perform certain actions because they're inherently right, rightness seems to be an independent feature of the action, and that explains why God wills we act that way. So morality is independent religion in that we can determine principles of right conduct through our own reason without relying on religious belief or authority. Now, the general applications of this are as follows. Are our actions right because we approve of them, or do we approve of them because they are right? Rightness then is going to depend on our beliefs, our desires, our feelings, and so on. Having a certain attitude makes an action right or a state of affairs good. Is the end good because we desire it, or do we desire that end because it's good? Well, that one's kind of tricky. Rightness and goodness then are features independent of our beliefs, of our desires, our feelings, and so forth. We have to ask then, are moral properties subjective? So in subjectivity, I am the subject. Subjective depends on my evaluative attitudes, how I feel about something personally. Or are moral properties objective? That is to ask, are they independent of our attitudes? And if I'm thinking clearly, if I'm thinking rationally, not being emotional, not being passionate, are they the basis of my evaluative attitudes? So as we look through Socrates, we kind of get some of these ideas coming together. Can we, for instance, admit that we're wrong and still deny that we ought to be punished? Why, yes, officer, I know I was going 15 over the limit, but really you ought to let me go. That's a different thing than saying, yeah, I killed him. Nothing wrong with a little killing from time to time. I'd kill again if I had the chance. So we run into these difficulties. And Socrates is not the one who deals with these most adroitly, but he is certainly the first historically. And so that's really why we start off with him. For next week, you're going to be reading selections from Plato's Republic, and you'll want to pay especially close attention to the Ring of Gyges, as well as Plato's Cave. Those are things that we're going to pull significant amounts of context out of, so do read that closely and carefully. If you had difficulties with the writing or just didn't like it this week, you may like it a little bit better as it is written differently. That is all I've got for you. As per the usual, should you have questions, concerns, comments, or want to engage in a discussion, by all means post something to the discussion page and I will get right back to you and we'll kind of pick it apart together. Thanks for joining in. Bye-bye.